This is Platform Diaries with Shane Williams, who chews the fat with entrepreneurs, startup founders and thought leaders on what it takes to traverse the wall between startup and scale up.
Do you ever feel like your phone is listening to your conversations and then serving you up ads? Or maybe you've received one of those notification emails identifying that your personal information has been breached. Stay tuned to this episode to find out how to do privacy well in your scale-up. You're listening to Platform Diaries, and I'm your host, Shane Williams. My guest today is James Taylor, founder and CEO at Particular Audience. James has a depth of knowledge in the startup scene, having been both a founder and investor across startups in APAC, the UK, and India. We discuss why privacy is increasingly important to digital businesses, the impact of the death of the third-party cookie and cross-site tracking, the biggest privacy mistakes that startups make, and what you can do to win in a challenging landscape. I hope you enjoy the interview. So James, thanks for joining me on Platform Diaries.
Thanks for having me, Shane.
Mate, I'll dive straight into our first question because I'm sure people are going to want to know this, and we'll start big picture. So why is it that privacy is so important for scale-ups and particularly e-com businesses?
I think there's a huge demand from consumers in general for privacy. I think there's been a huge amount of bad media, data leaks, practices that certain tech companies have had, and consumers are now much wiser to the fact that they can have their privacy and still get access to a lot of the things that they enjoy on the internet. I think that there are different regulatory changes in Europe, in parts of America, definitely in Canada, all requiring privacy and protection of the individual. And Australia is undoubtedly going to have to follow the example that's been set by those overseas regulatory bodies.
I think I was reading somewhere recently, I think it was an article from probably 2021 from Forbes, that there's something like 1,000 reported breaches in the US alone, but that, because of the size of their market, was like 150 million individuals impacted and stuff like that. So I can only imagine that shit's just going to ramp up, right?
It's nuts. I mean, you hear about Equifax, and Equifax have pretty much a file on every person somehow, somewhere. And for that data to get into the hands of a malicious operator is not acceptable.
No. So then if you think about why that's so important, who are kind of the classic or even the contemporary examples of who's doing privacy really well?
I think that the best examples of companies doing privacy well are companies that have no use for personally identifiable information in any sense whatsoever. And the examples of companies that have done it badly, that are really sort of front and center of mind, are platforms like Facebook. The fact that you could target to an individual of one historically on Facebook with enough filters or layers applying demographic information and location and what pages they follow and what pages they've liked, and that sort of stuff is creepy targeting. And Facebook simply don't allow that anymore. It's much more kind of aggregated groups and cohorts and obfuscated one-to-one ad targeting. But I think ads have developed a bit of a dirty brand as a result of that. So the advertising market in general, on one end of the spectrum, you have contextual advertising, which is the most acceptable because no one's tracking you across websites there. And that's the sort of advertising that's going to persist in a world with no third-party cookies. On the other side, you have ads that follow you around the internet, showing you the shoes that you've looked at or recommendations based on those shoes that you've looked at in a way that makes you feel like you've had your privacy infringed. That sort of across websites, no matter what you're doing, you're seeing this stuff, even across apps. And I think that the opt-in to apps tracking you across other apps on iOS was extremely low. I think it's something like 85% that was ask apps not to track.
Which was probably the first time people had ever had that option, right?
Right.
So when you say the ones who are doing it well are the organisations that have no need for, what sort of business doesn't need to know who I'm advertising to or who my customer is?
Well, I think you can look at platforms like Spotify and Netflix. They don't need to know anything about your demographic information to show you content that you like or content that you're most likely to want to engage with at any given point in time. Trying to make that prediction based off your demographic information or your name or your age. These things are not good indicators of what content you might like to watch, but the things that you've watched recently or the songs that you've just finished listening to in a playlist that's come to an end, they're the things that are most likely to be able to infer what else you might like to listen to, because without any person identifiable information, they know that of all of the customers that they had that interacted with those pieces of content previously, that by and large, they would go on to then listen to XYZ. So they can use that prediction data based on your context and your changing context rather than anything related to you as an individual. And the analogy is that Prince Charles and Ozzy Osbourne have the exact same demographic makeup, but their interests are vastly different.
Yeah, unless, of course, you're like me and your kids get a hold of your Netflix account and it starts suggesting stuff that you just have absolutely no interest in. But I'm sure I'm not the only one of those.
I've just got the Wiggles are climbing in my recommendations on Netflix.
Top 10 in Australia today, no doubt. All right, so then if we think about, I guess, the e-com space, what are sort of the biggest mistakes or the most common mistakes that startups make in the privacy space, do you think?
I think it's the assumption that you should personalize around the customer, which sounds like an obvious thing to say, but it's actually counterintuitive on what's effective. So if I'm new to the concept of personalization, then I might want to greet you by your first name when you come back to a website, right? Or I might want to say the weather and you're based in Sydney right now, the weather in Sydney is raining, here's an umbrella, right? But that kind of stuff isn't really a sort of suitable gauge on what your interests are. And frankly, it's not that impressive to you. You'd much rather just log into an e-commerce website and have the items that you are most likely to want to buy in that session there and available to you right away. So I think that it's very much changing that mindset of customer data to it's in fact product data and the relationships between products and the products that people engage with, and therefore showing them what else is relevant to them. That is the robust data set to try to make predictions from. And personalization is ultimately just making good predictions. So of course you want the most robust data. The other thing that's been ingrained into the e-com manager or the marketer's mindset is the idea of segments and cohorts of customer. And of course, if you start to group customers by some tenuous attributes that you're able to group those on, such as middle-aged men in Sydney, you're going to lose a lot of the effectiveness of that personalization, right? Back to the segment examples or the demographic information. But the reason that that's been trained is because many advertising platforms, and especially kind of sort of customer data or email marketing platforms, they work in the form of segments. You can create different variants of a message and you can send each variant out to a different segment. But why do that if you seriously can personalize based on the individual and nothing to do on the data of that individual, but the items that that individual has engaged with most recently?
And then if you think about, I guess, the Amazon model of these are the things you had in your cart that you didn't close. Other people who looked at those also looked at these. That's the, I guess, inferred you might like these, as opposed to you live in a particular suburb, therefore you might like this particular type of mower.
Totally right. Yeah. Your neighbour's very different to you. But if you've looked at a bunch of mowers, then we know that of all the people that looked at those mowers, they ultimately went on to buy this mower.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. So then what are the steps that you would recommend for, I guess, an ability to win in what seems to be a particularly challenging e-com landscape?
I think it's just relevance. I mean, you can look at relevance and scale. So, of course, there are going to be boutique opportunities, direct-to-consumer brands that only have a few items, shopping boutiques that only merchandise or stock a few items. But by and large, the e-commerce model converts more customers and earns more money the more products they have. I think that the stat is that for every 10% increase in product catalog, you actually have a 12% increase in revenue because you're able to appease more niches. You're able to get more traffic from more Google shopping searches. But what you have with this seemingly endless aisle on an e-commerce store or e-commerce platform is long tails that start to form. Because if you have a static website experience for every customer that comes on there, that creates a natural ceiling in terms of the number of products that you can have. Now, Amazon solved this very early. Amazon have 300 million products. Amazon sell 200,000 coat hangers, right? So how can you actually start to create intuitive and personalized filtering experiences that can truly create a different website for every customer? Well, you can use those wisdom of the crowd based algorithms to say, well, because we know what you've looked at, even in an unrelated category like you've looked at jeans, we know when you go into the mowers section, which mowers are most relevant to you based on the jeans that you've looked at. All right, it's a pretty abstract example, but bear with me on it. And of course, with a site catalog that's growing, in that long tail, you still have lots of items without any behavioral data on them at all. So you can't say, well, people that looked at these items also looked at this, because many of those items might not have that data on it. So in that case, you have to use alternative approaches like natural language processing to find out which items have the most similar attributes to items that have been viewed by a customer, or computer vision to see which items are most visually similar to the items a customer is looking at in that session. And that way you can automatically filter the website. Another example might be if you go to a website and you go into a product category, let's say like the Iconic or ASOS, you might have many pages of pagination, right? If you have to click, you go into t-shirts and you have to click through like 20 different pages to view all the results. Well, that's crazy. And many people won't get to the end of that. Whereas if you can re-rank that entire product list based on what you know about that customer's interests and intent, it can be a really effective way to scale your catalog, sell to more niches, and ensure relevant experiences for each individual with their own niche interests when they come to the site.
Much like the secret sauce behind the Google front page.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's what's relevant. It's having a semantic understanding of what the customer's doing, and whether that's a semantic and personalized search experience, whereas obviously depending on the input from the customer to drive a search, or making search redundant through product recommendations and automated merchandising that is so effective at making the accurate prediction that a customer doesn't even have to use search, right? And, behind particular audience is ultimately we're trying to make search engines even redundant on the internet. We want to make the internet semantic in their way of understanding what anybody's interest or intent is at any given context, so that we can put information in front of them without them having to ask.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I was drawing the analogy between, I don't think anybody ever goes past the first page when they're presented with their results, right? You kind of want a shopping experience that's the same. You know enough about me to know what I want without me having to go digging.
Totally right. And then you come back to that Amazon example where they have 200,000 coat hangers. Well, you're probably going to not even scroll past the first three because it's a fairly commoditized thing. So it's no surprise that Amazon's platform is now pretty much entirely pay to play. Their sponsored products, their retail media platform allows the coat hanger seller with the highest bid,
deepest pocket,
highest bid to get that exposure, rank top of those search results. And we actually, particular audience, we provide that to other retailers. So we allow them to onboard their vendors, their suppliers, their brands, and those brands can pay to promote their items in relevant search and recommendations.
So that's probably a good segue into my next question, which is what is next for particular audience?
I think this retail media platform is absolutely paramount in terms of timing. Third-party cookies go away at the end of 2023, which means that I mentioned earlier contextual advertising, that will remain, but it's going to be harder to measure the performance of those contextual ads cross-domain without any cross-domain tracking. And any kind of ad retargeting where you're trying to track behavior across websites using third-party cookies to then retarget items to those customers, that will disappear entirely. So the ability to spend money on ads, to target adverts at customers, and to measure the performance of adverts across sites is all going to be weighed a lot harder without third-party cookies. So we see retail media as actually being almost a sort of huge sort of magnetism for advertising dollars, because retailers will be able to earn money from their front end, much like how Amazon is making nearly $30 billion a year at the moment. And advertisers will be able to pay to promote their items to in-market consumers. Samsung can pay to ensure that their equivalent fridges are shown to customers that are currently browsing LG fridges, right? That's really valuable real estate. And better yet, it's all first-party measurement. So Samsung will actually be able to measure the return on ad spend that they're getting through people checking out or not on that retailer's website.
And all without necessarily needing to know anything about who that person is or their demographic.
Correct. We just needed to know that that customer was in market for, based on their search or the products that they'd viewed or the products that were in their basket or the sequence of products that they viewed.
Which is perfect when you think about the initial problem we were talking about, the number of privacy breaches and the amount of first-person data that's stored that is likely to be leaked. If it's never stored, it's never known, then it's never likely to be leaked, right? Absolutely right.
Absolutely right.
James, thanks for your time. That's about all we've got time for. I appreciate you joining us, and we'll talk again soon.
Cheers, Shane. Thanks for having me.
You've been listening to Platform Diaries with Shane Williams. To find out about how Shane enables digital businesses to scale, please visit shanewilliams.com.au. Thank you for listening.